The morning sun cast long shadows across the training field at Fort Henderson, but Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wasn't watching the sunrise. She was watching Drill Sergeant Rick Morrison's face turn the color of ripe tomatoes as he screamed at Private Jennifer Hayes, spittle flying from his mouth like venom from a snake's fangs. "You worthless piece of trash!" Morrison's voice echoed across the assembled formation of 205 soldiers, all standing at rigid attention in perfect rows. "You think this is some kind of joke? You think the Army is your personal playground? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Maria's jaw tightened as she observed from her position at the edge of the formation. At 32, she had seen enough of Morrison's theatrics to recognize the dangerous edge creeping into his voice. The morning's physical training had ended 20 minutes ago, but Morrison had singled out Hayes for what he called additional motivation, a practice that had become increasingly common and increasingly brutal over the past 6 months. Private Hayes, barely 19 and fresh out of basic training, stood trembling in the center of the formation. Her blonde hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance that Maria recognized all too well. The girl reminded her of herself at that age, determined, idealistic, and completely unprepared for the reality of systematic harassment disguised as military discipline. "I asked you a question, soldier." Morrison stepped closer to Hayes, his massive frame towering over her petite 5'3" stature. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and Maria could see the telltale signs of his escalating rage, the way his nostrils flared, the way his shoulders hunched forward like a predator preparing to strike. "No, Drill Sergeant," Hayes whispered, her voice barely audible across the field. "What was that? I can't hear you." Morrison leaned in until his face was inches from hers, his hot breath fogging in the cool morning air. "Maybe if you weren't so busy thinking about your boyfriend back home, you could focus on following simple instructions." Maria's hands tightened into fists. She knew about Hayes' boyfriend, a sweet kid named Tommy who sent letters every week, letters that Hayes treasured like precious gems. Morrison had no business bringing personal matters into his psychological warfare, but that had never stopped him before. The formation remained motionless. 204 soldiers trying to look straight ahead, while witnessing the systematic destruction of their fellow service member. Maria could feel the tension radiating from the assembled troops like heat from asphalt on a summer day. Some of them, particularly the younger male soldiers, seemed to enjoy the spectacle, their eyes gleaming with the cruel satisfaction of seeing someone else become Morrison's target. Others, like Corporal Mike Chun, standing 2 rows ahead of her, kept their faces carefully neutral while their eyes burned with suppressed anger. "You know what your problem is, Hayes?" Morrison circled around her like a shark sensing blood in the water. "You think you're special. You think because you scored high on your ASVAB and graduated top of your class in 8, that makes you better than everyone else here." Maria knew this wasn't true. In the 3 months since Hayes had arrived at Fort Henderson, the young woman had been nothing but respectful, hardworking, and eager to prove herself. She volunteered for extra duties, helped struggling soldiers with their studies, and never complained, not even when Morrison assigned her to clean the latrines for the 3rd time in a single week. "But you're not special," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried across the entire formation. "You're just another weak little girl who doesn't belong in a real soldier's army. You want to know what I think? I think you should pack your bags and go home to mommy before you get someone killed." Hayes' composure finally cracked. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and Maria watched as the girl's shoulders began to shake with the effort of holding back her emotions. It was exactly what Morrison wanted, the moment of vulnerability that would justify his next level of escalation. "Oh, what's this?" Morrison's voice took on a mocking, sing-song quality, that made Maria's skin crawl. "Are we crying now? Is the little baby soldier going to cry?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Maria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. She had been at Fort Henderson for 8 years, had worked her way up from private to staff sergeant through a combination of skill, determination, and careful political navigation. She had seen commanders come and go, had watched good soldiers break under the pressure of toxic leadership, had learned to pick her battles and keep her head down. But something about this moment felt different. Something about the way Morrison was savoring Hayes' tears, the way the formation was watching in silent complicity, the way the entire system seemed designed to crush the spirit of anyone who dared to be different. Morrison raised his hand, and Maria could see his intention as clearly as if he had announced it over a megaphone. He was going to strike Hayes. Not hard enough to leave visible marks, but hard enough to make his point. It was a line he had been approaching for months, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with, and now he was finally ready to cross it. The hand came down in a vicious backhand aimed at Hayes' face, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Maria could see every detail with crystalline clarity, the hatred in Morrison's eyes, the tears on Hayes' cheeks, the collective intake of breath from 204 soldiers who suddenly realized they were about to witness something that would change everything. But the blow never landed. Maria had moved without conscious thought, her body acting on pure instinct and 8 years of combat training. She intercepted Morrison's arm with a fluid motion that looked almost like a dance, redirecting his momentum and using his own force against him. The crack of his radius bone echoing across the formation was as sharp and final as a gunshot. Morrison's scream of pain and rage shattered the morning silence like glass hitting concrete. He dropped to his knees, cradling his broken arm against his chest, his face contorting with shock and disbelief. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire formation stood frozen in place, processing what they had just witnessed. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a decorated combat veteran with 2 tours in Afghanistan and a spotless service record, had just broken her superior's arm in front of 205 witnesses. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, heavy and ominous and impossible to ignore. "Formation dismissed," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that came from somewhere deeper than rank or position. "Return to your barracks and prepare for the duty day." The soldiers began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of excitement and fear that followed them across the base like a swarm of angry bees. Some looked at Maria with newfound respect, others with horror, and a few with the calculating expression of people already planning how to use this information to their advantage. Corporal Chun lingered for a moment, catching Maria's eye with a look that said everything words couldn't. Then he shepherded Private Hayes away from the scene, his protective stance making it clear that anyone who wanted to get to her would have to go through him first. Maria knelt beside Morrison, who was still writhing in pain and muttering threats through gritted teeth. "Sergeant Morrison," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough volume for the remaining soldiers to hear, "I recommend you report to the medical facility for treatment of your injury. I'll be filing a report with the first sergeant about this incident." Morrison's eyes blazed with fury and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "You have no idea what you've just done," he hissed. "No idea at all." Maria stood up, brushing dust from her uniform with calm, deliberate movements. "I know exactly what I've done," she replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about?" As Morrison was helped to his feet by 2 junior soldiers and escorted toward the medical facility, Maria remained alone on the training field. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, burning away the shadows and bathing the empty space in golden light. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the familiar sounds of military life continuing. Engines starting, voices calling. Out commands, the steady rhythm of soldiers going about their duties. But something fundamental had shifted. The careful balance of power that had governed Fort Henderson for years had been disrupted in the space of a few seconds. And Maria knew there would be consequences. The only question was whether those consequences would destroy her career, her future, and everything she had worked to build, or whether they would finally force the system to confront the poison that had been festering in its ranks for far too long. She looked down at her hands, still steady despite everything that had just happened. These were hands that had fired weapons in combat, that had saved lives in field hospitals, that had comforted dying soldiers and written letters to their families. And now they were hands that had broken a superior officer's arm in defense of a principle that seemed almost quake in the harsh reality of military politics. The weight of 205 witnesses pressed down on her like a physical force. By noon, every soldier on the base would know what had happened. By evening, the story would have reached the commanding officer. And by tomorrow morning, Maria Santos would either be a hero or a cautionary tale, possibly both. But as she walked across the empty training field toward an uncertain future, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of absolute certainty that she had done the right thing, regardless of the cost. Private Hayes was safe. Morrison's reign of terror had been publicly challenged, and for the first time in months, the silence of complicity had been broken by the sound of justice being served. The question that echoed in her mind as she headed toward what might be the most important day of her military career was simple and devastating. What happens when doing the right thing means destroying everything you've worked for? The answer, she knew, would reveal itself soon enough. Maria Santos had never intended to become a symbol of anything. She had enlisted in the Army 8 years ago for the same reasons as most of her generation: college money, steady work, and a chance to serve something larger than herself. Born in San Antonio to parents who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they never had, Maria understood the weight of expectations and the price of progress. Her father, Miguel Santos, had worked double shifts at a construction company for 23 years, his hands growing increasingly gnarled with arthritis, but his spirit never wavering in its dedication to his family. Her mother, Alina, cleaned office buildings at night and took care of elderly neighbors during the day, her gentle strength serving as the foundation upon which their household rested. They had raised Maria and her younger brother Carlos with a simple philosophy: respect others, work hard, and never let anyone convince you that you're worth less than you are. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that she now found herself in a situation that perfectly embodied those principles, and potentially threatened everything her parents had sacrificed to help her achieve. Her daily routine at Fort Henderson had, until this morning, been a carefully choreographed dance of competence and political awareness. She woke at 0430 every morning, 30 minutes before her alarm, a habit developed during her deployment to Afghanistan, where sleeping too deeply could mean missing the sound of incoming mortar. Her small apartment off base reflected her practical nature: clean, organized, with personal touches that spoke of someone who valued substance over appearance. Family photos dominated her dresser: her parents at their 25th wedding anniversary, Carlos in his college graduation gown, herself with her unit in Kabul. All of them younger and more innocent than they appeared now. Maria's morning routine began with coffee, strong, black, no sugar, while she reviewed the day's training schedule and identified potential friction points. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict when conflicts would arise, which soldiers were struggling, and which situations required intervention before they exploded into crises. This morning had been different, though. This morning, she had felt a tension in the air that reminded her of the minutes before a firefight, when everything seemed normal, but your instincts screamed that danger was approaching. Her relationship with the other NCOs at Fort Henderson was complex and carefully maintained. Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez, who worked in supply, had become her closest friend on base, a steady, principled man who shared her belief that leadership meant protecting the soldiers under your command, not exploiting them. They often ate lunch together, discussing everything from military policy to their families back home, their conversations serving as a refuge from the political minefield that military bases could become. Sergeant First Class Amanda Walsh, who ran the motor pool, was more pragmatic in her approach to base politics. She had survived 15 years in the Army by keeping her head down and avoiding controversy, and she often warned Maria about the dangers of making waves. "The Army doesn't reward boat rockers," she would say during their weekly coffee meetings. "It chews them up and spits them out. You're a good soldier, Santos, but good soldiers don't always survive if they make the wrong enemies." The advice had always frustrated Maria, partly because she knew Amanda was right. The military, despite its official policies about equality and justice, remained an institution where personal relationships and informal power structures often mattered more than regulations or merit. Morrison's behavior was a perfect example. Everyone knew he crossed lines. Everyone had witnessed his increasingly aggressive treatment of soldiers he perceived as weak or different, but nobody wanted to be the one to officially challenge him. Maria's own experience with discrimination had been subtle but persistent throughout her career. As a Latina woman in a predominantly white male institution, she had learned to navigate a complex web of expectations and assumptions. Some superior officers had dismissed her achievements, attributing her success to affirmative action rather than ability. Others had made inappropriate comments about her appearance or personal life, comments that walked the fine line between harassment and harmless military humor. The worst incident had occurred during her second deployment, when a captain had cornered her in a supply tent and suggested that her next promotion might depend on her willingness to provide certain additional services. Maria had reported the incident, following proper channels and believing that the system would protect her. Instead, she had found herself transferred to a different unit with a notation in her file about difficulty working with superior officers, a career-damaging label that had taken her 2 years to overcome. The experience had taught her hard lessons about the difference between official policy and unofficial reality. It had also strengthened her resolve to protect soldiers like Private Hayes, who reminded her so much of herself at that age, idealistic, determined, and completely unprepared for the ways that predators could use the military's hierarchical structure to exploit their victims. Hayes wasn't the first soldier Morrison had targeted. Over the past 6 months, Maria had watched him systematically break down 3 other young soldiers, 2 men and 1 woman, using techniques that were perfectly legal under military regulations, but devastatingly effective at destroying morale and self-confidence. Private Marcus Johnson had requested a transfer after Morrison's training left him with panic attacks, so severe he couldn't function in formation. Specialist Sarah Kim had gone from being one of the unit's most promising soldiers to barely meeting minimum standards, her confidence shattered by months of public humiliation and verbal abuse. The pattern was always the same. Morrison would identify soldiers he perceived as weak, different, or threatening to his authority. He would then subject them to increasingly intense harassment, always careful to stay within the technical boundaries of legal military discipline. When his victims finally broke, requesting transfers, accepting demotions, or in some cases, attempting suicide, Morrison would point to their failures as justification for his methods. Maria had tried to intervene in subtle ways, offering encouragement to Morrison's victims, providing additional training to help them meet his impossible standards, even speaking privately with other NCOs about the pattern she observed. But the military's chain of command made direct intervention difficult. and Morrison's political connections made challenging him openly dangerous. Drill Sergeant Morrison wasn't just another toxic NCO. He was the nephew of Colonel Patricia Morrison, the base's deputy commander. This family connection had insulated him from consequences for years, allowing his behavior to escalate without meaningful oversight. Other NCOs knew about the relationship and factored it into their calculations about whether Morrison was worth challenging. Most had decided he'd send single quotes to Maria had known about the family connection too. She had also known that breaking Morrison's arm in front of 205 witnesses would likely end her military career, destroy her chances of advancement, and potentially result in criminal charges. But in that moment, watching him prepare to strike, a 19-year-old soldier whose only crime was showing emotion under stress, Maria had discovered that some lines couldn't be crossed, not by her, not in her presence, not while she still had the power to stop it. The realization had been both liberating and terrifying. For 8 years, she had carefully built her career, following rules and navigating politics with the skill of a diplomat. She had learned to pick her battles, to compromise when necessary, to work within a flawed system rather than against it. But watching Morrison's hand descend toward Hayes' face, Maria had understood that all of her careful calculations meant nothing if she couldn't look at herself in the mirror the next morning. Her parents had raised her to believe that there were moments in life when you had to choose between what was safe and what was right. They had made that choice themselves, immigrating to America despite the risks, working multiple jobs to support their children's dreams, standing up to discrimination even when it cost them opportunities. Maria had always admired their courage from a distance, never fully understanding the weight of such decisions until now. As she sat in her apartment that afternoon, waiting for the inevitable phone call from her commanding officer, Maria thought about the soldiers she had served with in Afghanistan. She remembered Private Danny Sullivan, barely 18, who had stepped on an IED while trying to help Afghan children reach safety. She thought about Sergeant Lisa Park, who had died shielding her subordinates from sniper fire. She remembered all the good soldiers who had paid the ultimate price for their principles, and she wondered what they would think about her decision to risk her career for one moment of justice. The phone rang at 13:47 hours, exactly when Maria had expected it would. First Sergeant Michael Thompson's voice was carefully neutral, professionally distant in a way that told her everything she needed to know about how this situation was being handled. Staff Sergeant Santos, report to my office at 1500 hours for an administrative meeting. Bring your service record and be prepared for an extended discussion about this morning's incident. Roger, First Sergeant, I'll be there. Santos? Thompson's voice softened almost imperceptibly. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're planning to say, remember that everything you do from this point forward will be scrutinized by people who don't necessarily have your best interests at heart. Choose your words carefully. The line went dead, leaving Maria staring at her phone and wondering if Thompson's warning was meant as advice or threat. She had always respected the first sergeant, a 20-year veteran who had earned his position through competence and integrity. But she also knew that he was part of a system that had allowed Morrison's behavior to continue unchecked for months. Maria spent the next hour reviewing her service record, not to prepare her defense, but to remind herself of who she had been before this morning changed everything. 8 years of commendations, training certifications, and performance evaluations painted a picture of a soldier who had consistently exceeded expectations. Letters of appreciation from commanding officers, certificates from specialized schools, photos from ceremonies where she had been recognized for her leadership and dedication. But as she looked through the documents, Maria realized that none of it captured the most important aspects of her service. There was no commendation for the late-night conversations with homesick soldiers, no award for the extra training sessions that had helped struggling subordinates meet their goals, no certificate for the small acts of kindness that had made military life bearable for dozens of her fellow service members. The real measure of her career wasn't in the files and forms that would be scrutinized by investigating officers. It was in the lives she had touched, the soldiers she had mentored, the culture she had tried to create within her sphere of influence. And now, in one violent moment that had lasted less than 5 seconds, she had potentially thrown it all away to protect one 19-year-old private who might not even appreciate the sacrifice. But as Maria prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her, she found herself thinking not about what she was losing, but about what she had gained. For the first time in her military career, she had acted on pure principle, without calculation or compromise. She had chosen protection over politics, justice over self-preservation, moral courage over professional advancement. The woman who walked toward First Sergeant Thompson's office at 14:55 hours was both the same Maria Santos who had enlisted 8 years earlier, and someone completely different. She was still the daughter of Miguel and Elena Santos, still the soldier who believed in serving something larger than herself. But she was also something new, a person who had discovered the exact point where her principles would no longer bend without breaking. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base as Maria made her way to what might be the most important meeting of her life. Behind her lay 8 years of careful career building, political navigation, and professional achievement. Ahead lay unknown consequences that could range from administrative punishment to court-martial, from career destruction to criminal conviction. But for the first time in months, Maria Santos felt completely at peace with who she was and what she had done. Whatever happened next would be a test not just of her actions, but of the system she had served faithfully for 8 years. And regardless of the outcome, she knew that she had finally become the soldier and the woman her parents had raised her to be. The administrative building at Fort Henderson hummed with an energy that Maria had never felt before. As she walked down the corridor toward First Sergeant Thompson's office, she could feel eyes tracking her movement from every doorway, every desk, every corner where soldiers had suddenly found urgent reasons to linger. News traveled fast on military bases, but this morning's incident had spread with the velocity of wildfire in dry grass. Specialist Rodriguez from S1 personnel pretended to study a bulletin board as Maria passed, but she could see him stealing glances in her peripheral vision. Sergeant Martinez from the headquarters company was having an animated conversation with 2 junior soldiers, their whispers growing quiet as she approached and resuming the moment she passed. Even the civilian contractors working on the building's HVAC system seemed to pause in their work to observe the woman who had broken a drill sergeant's arm in front of 200 witnesses. Maria had experienced something similar during her deployments, the way news of significant events rippled through military communities, growing and changing with each retelling until the original incident became the seed of legend. But those stories had always been about other people, distant figures whose actions affected her unit, but not her personally. Now she was walking into the center of a story that would define the rest of her career and possibly her life. First, Sergeant Thompson's office occupied a corner of the building, its windows offering a view of the training fields where this morning's confrontation had taken place. Maria could see soldiers conducting afternoon physical training, their movements precise and coordinated, the routine continuing unchanged despite the morning's disruption. The sight reminded her that the Army was larger than any individual incident, more enduring than personal crises, designed to absorb and adapt to disruptions without losing its fundamental character. Thompson was waiting for her behind his desk, his posture radiating the kind of professional neutrality that veteran NCOs perfected over decades of navigating complex situations. At 43, he was old enough to have earned his authority through experience rather than politics, young enough to remember what it felt like to be a junior soldier facing consequences for actions that seemed justified in the moment. His office reflected his personality, organized without being obsessive, professional without being cold, decorated with unit photographs and commendations that spoke of a career built on competence rather than connections. "Sergeant Santos, have a seat." Thompson's voice carried the weight of 20 years in uniform, but Maria detected something else beneath the official tone: concern, perhaps, or uncertainty about how to handle a situation that fell outside normal parameters. "First Sergeant." Maria settled into the chair across from his desk, maintaining the proper military bearing while internally bracing for whatever was about to unfold. Thompson opened a manila folder that Maria assumed contained her service record, though she couldn't see its contents from her position. He spent several moments reviewing documents she knew by heart: performance evaluations, training certifications, deployment records that chronicled 8 years of dedicated service. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to voice. "Tell me what happened this morning," Thompson said finally, his tone suggesting this was the beginning of a formal inquiry rather than a casual conversation. Maria had spent the past 3 hours mentally rehearsing this moment, considering how much detail to include, what interpretation to offer, whether to focus on Morrison's pattern of behavior or limit herself to the specific incident. She had decided on complete honesty, regardless of the personal cost. At approximately 0730 hours, Drill Sergeant Morrison was conducting what he called additional motivation for Private Hayes following the completion of morning PT. I observed the interaction from my position at the edge of the formation and became concerned when Sergeant Morrison's behavior escalated beyond standard corrective training. Thompson made notes as she spoke, his expression remaining carefully neutral. Define escalated beyond standard corrective training. Sergeant Morrison was using personal information about Private Hayes' relationships to cause emotional distress, making statements about her fitness for military service that appeared designed to humiliate rather than correct, and creating a hostile environment that I assessed as potentially dangerous. Potentially dangerous how? This was the crucial question, the point where Maria's interpretation of Morrison's intentions would either justify her actions or condemn them. She could see Thompson watching her carefully, waiting for her response to determine how he would frame the rest of this conversation. Sergeant Morrison raised his hand in what I recognized as a threatening gesture directed at Private Hayes, based on his body language, his escalating aggression, and the pattern of behavior I had observed. Over the previous several months, I assessed that he intended to strike her. Thompson set down his pen and looked directly at Maria for the first time since she had entered his office. "You're alleging that Drill Sergeant Morrison was about to assault a soldier under his command?" "I'm stating that I observed behavior that led me to believe Private Hayes was in immediate danger, and I responded accordingly to neutralize that threat." The first sergeant leaned back in his chair, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts on Maria's explanation. In the silence that followed, Maria could hear the normal sounds of military life continuing around them, phones ringing in distant offices, vehicles starting in the parking lot, the muffled sound of soldiers conducting business throughout the building. "Sergeant Santos, you understand the seriousness of what you're alleging? You're suggesting that a drill sergeant with 15 years of service was about to commit assault in front of 200 witnesses. I understand that my allegations are serious, First Sergeant. I also understand that my response was serious. I wouldn't have intervened if I hadn't believed the situation required immediate action." Thompson reopened the folder and appeared to review additional documents. Maria wondered what other information had made its way into her file since this morning: witness statements, medical reports from Morrison's treatment, preliminary assessments from officers who would be tasked with determining her fate. "I've received preliminary statements from several soldiers who witnessed the incident," Thompson continued. "Their accounts of what happened are varied." Maria felt her chest tighten. She had expected this, the inevitable process by which clear events became muddy through multiple perspectives, personal biases, and political considerations. In a community where loyalty to the chain of command often trumped objective truth, witness statements could be shaped by factors having nothing to do with what actually occurred. Some soldiers report that Drill Sergeant Morrison was conducting standard corrective training when you intervened without provocation, Thompson said, reading from what appeared to be a summary document. Others describe a more escalated situation, consistent with your account. A few suggest that there may have been ongoing tensions between you and Sergeant Morrison that contributed to this morning's incident. The last observation hit Maria like a physical blow. She had been careful to maintain proper professional relationships with all her colleagues, including Morrison, despite her growing concerns about his methods. But she realized now that her subtle attempts to protect his victims might have been interpreted as insubordination or personal animosity. "First Sergeant, I want to be clear about something," Maria said, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that every phrase would be analyzed and scrutinized. "I have never had a personal conflict with Drill Sergeant Morrison. My concerns about his training methods were based on my observations of their impact on soldiers under his command, not on any personal grievance." Thompson nodded, making additional notes. "Tell me about those observations. What specific incidents led you to believe that Sergeant Morrison's methods were problematic?" This was the moment Maria had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. For months, she had watched Morrison's systematic harassment of soldiers like Hayes, collecting mental evidence of behavior that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of military regulations. She had documentation of some incidents, late-night conversations with distraught soldiers, reports of performance problems that seemed to correlate with Morrison's attention, patterns that painted a clear picture of toxic leadership. But she also knew that raising these issues now would be seen as an attempt to justify her actions after the fact, a way of deflecting attention from her own behavior by attacking Morrison's record. It was a politically dangerous move that could backfire spectacularly if her allegations couldn't be substantiated. "Over the past 6 months, I observed a pattern of behavior that I believed was inconsistent with effective military leadership," Maria began carefully. "Soldiers who came under Sergeant Morrison's focused attention showed signs of severe stress that went beyond normal training challenges. 3 soldiers requested transfers or accepted demotions rather than continue serving under his supervision. Others showed signs of anxiety, depression, and performance degradation that I attributed to the hostile training environment he created." Thompson's expression remained neutral, but Maria could see him processing the implications of her statement. If her allegations were true, they represented a systematic failure of leadership oversight that extended beyond Morrison to the NCOs and officers who should have recognized and addressed the problem. "Did you report these concerns through proper channels?" "I discussed my observations with other NCOs, informally, hoping to develop a better understanding of the situation before taking formal action. I also provided additional mentoring and support to soldiers who appeared to be struggling, believing that approach would be more effective than initiating complaints that might be seen as undermining unit cohesion." It was a careful answer that acknowledged her failure to make formal reports while explaining her reasoning. Maria knew that military regulations required her to report observed misconduct, but she also knew that premature, unsubstantiated allegations could destroy careers and relationships within the tight-knit military community. Thompson closed the folder and steepled his fingers, a gesture that Maria recognized as a signal that they were moving from fact-gathering to assessment. "Sergeant Santos, I'm going to be direct with you about the situation you're facing. Drill Sergeant Morrison has been treated for a fractured radius and released from medical care. He has declined to press charges at this time, but that decision could change. The commanding officer has ordered a formal investigation into this morning's incident, which will include interviews with all witnesses and a comprehensive review of both your service record and Sergeant Morrison's training methods." Maria felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The absence of immediate charges was encouraging, but a formal investigation would expose every aspect of her military career to scrutiny. More importantly, it would force the command structure to examine Morrison's behavior, a development that could either vindicate her actions or make her appear to be a vindictive subordinate, trying to destroy a superior's reputation. In the meantime, Thompson continued, you're being temporarily reassigned to administrative duties, pending the completion of the investigation. You'll report to Captain Williams and S1 personnel starting tomorrow morning, and will have no contact with soldiers from Drill Sergeant Morrison's unit until this matter is resolved. The administrative reassignment was standard procedure for situations like this, but Maria understood its symbolic significance. She was being removed from her leadership role, isolated from the soldiers she had been trying to protect, reduced to processing paperwork while other people decided her fate. I understand, First Sergeant. Thompson studied her for a long moment, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal something that looked almost like admiration. Sergeant Santos. Off the record. And I want to emphasize that this conversation is off the record. What you did this morning took considerable courage. Right or wrong, you acted on principle in a situation where most soldiers would have looked the other way. Maria felt tears threatening for the first time since the morning's incident. The acknowledgement of her motivations, even unofficial and carefully qualified, provided a validation she hadn't realized she needed. But, Thompson continued, his voice hardening back to official neutrality, courage and good intentions don't excuse violations of military discipline. You broke a superior officer's arm, and that action will have consequences regardless of your motivations. The best outcome you can hope for is that the investigation will reveal sufficient justification for your actions to minimize those consequences. As Maria left Thompson's office 20 minutes later, she felt the weight of the next few weeks settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. The administrative building seemed different now, not just a place where military business was conducted, but a battleground where her future would be determined by people who had never witnessed Morrison's behavior, never seen the fear in Private Hayes' eyes, never faced the choice between personal safety and moral obligation. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Maria walked across the base toward her apartment, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the sunsets she had watched from guard towers in Afghanistan. Those deployments had taught her about the difference between theoretical courage and the real thing, between following orders and making decisions that would haunt you forever, but they had also taught her that some moments define who you are, more clearly than years of routine service. This morning, in the space of 5 seconds, Maria Santos had discovered exactly who she was and what she was willing to sacrifice for her principles. The investigation ahead would determine whether that discovery would cost her everything she had worked to achieve, or whether it would finally force the system to confront the poison that had been festering in its ranks. As she reached her apartment, Maria paused to look back at the base that had been her home for 8 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new scrutiny, new opportunities for both vindication and destruction. But tonight, for the first time in months, she would sleep without wondering what she could have done differently. The system was responding to her actions as she had known it would. The only question now was whether that response would serve justice or simply protect itself from uncomfortable truths. The investigation began at 800 hours on Tuesday morning with the arrival of Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Inspector General's office at Fort Campbell. Maria first saw her walking across the headquarters parking lot, a tall, angular woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating military bureaucracy without losing her sense of purpose. Colonel Mitchell's reputation preceded her. She was known throughout the Army as a thorough, impartial investigator who followed evidence wherever it led, regardless of political implications. Maria was processing personnel files in the S1 office. when Corporal Davis from the first sergeant's office appeared at her desk with a message that would change everything. Staff Sergeant Santos, Colonel Mitchell requests your presence in Conference Room B at 1000 hours for an interview regarding the incident of August 16th. You have the right to have legal counsel present. The formal language carried weight that settled in Maria's stomach like cold stone. This wasn't going to be another administrative conversation like the one with First Sergeant Thompson. This was the beginning of a process that would either vindicate her actions or destroy her career, and possibly her freedom. Conference Room B was a sterile space designed for official business. Beige walls, government-issued furniture, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. Colonel Mitchell had arranged her materials with military precision: legal pads, recording equipment, manila folders that undoubtedly contained witness statements and service records. She looked up as Maria entered, her gray eyes assessing and intelligent. Staff Sergeant Santos, thank you for coming. Please have a seat. Mitchell's voice carried authority without aggression, the tone of someone accustomed to getting honest answers through competence rather than intimidation. I'm Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Inspector General's office. I'll be conducting this investigation into the events of Monday morning involving you and Drill Sergeant Morrison. Maria settled into the chair across from Mitchell, maintaining proper military bearing while internally steeling herself for what was to come. She had spent the previous evening reviewing every detail of Monday morning, preparing for questions that might challenge her memory, her motivations, or her perception of events. This interview is being recorded, Mitchell continued, activating the digital recorder with a soft click. You have been advised of your right to legal counsel. Do you wish to have an attorney present? No, ma'am. I'm prepared to answer your questions without counsel. Mitchell nodded and opened the first folder. Let's begin with your version of the events of Monday, August 16th, beginning with the end of morning physical training. For the next 45 minutes, Maria recounted every detail she could remember: Morrison's escalating aggression, Hayes' visible distress, the moment when she recognized the threat and acted to neutralize it. Mitchell listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but never betraying her reactions to Maria's account. You stated that you observed a pattern of behavior from Drill Sergeant Morrison over several months, Mitchell said when Maria finished her narrative. Can you provide specific examples? This was the moment Maria had been preparing for, the opportunity to present evidence of Morrison's systematic harassment that went far beyond Monday morning's incident. She had spent hours the previous evening documenting everything she could remember, creating a timeline of incidents that painted a disturbing picture of toxic leadership. Beginning in March, I observed Sergeant Morrison singling out soldiers for what he called motivation sessions that appeared designed to cause maximum psychological distress rather than improve performance, Maria began. Private Marcus Johnson was subjected to daily public humiliation regarding his Louisiana accent and rural background. When Johnson began showing signs of severe anxiety, Morrison intensified the harassment rather than adjusting his approach. Mitchell made detailed notes as Maria continued, describing incident after incident that had troubled her over the past months. Specialist Sarah Kim forced to repeat physical exercises until she collapsed, then berated for weakness while lying on the ground. Private David Chun subjected to racist comments disguised as military humor. Soldier after soldier pushed beyond the boundaries of legitimate training into territory that served no purpose except to satisfy Morrison's apparent need to dominate and control. Did you document any of these incidents? Mitchell asked. Not formally, ma'am. I provided informal counseling to soldiers who were struggling and discussed my concerns with other NCOs, but I didn't file official reports. Why not? It was a fair question that Maria had been asking herself for months. Why hadn't she taken formal action sooner? Why had she allowed Morrison's behavior to continue when she clearly recognized it as problematic? Several factors influenced my decision, Maria replied carefully. First, Sergeant Morrison was technically within the bounds of authorized corrective training, even though I believed his methods were counterproductive. Second, the soldiers involved were reluctant to make formal complaints, often asking me, specifically, not to escalate the issues. Third, I was concerned that premature allegations might be dismissed as personality conflicts rather than legitimate leadership concerns. Mitchell's expression suggested she understood the political dynamics that had shaped Maria's calculations. Military communities were small, insular environments where accusations of misconduct could backfire spectacularly if they weren't substantiated beyond doubt. Tell me about your relationship with Drill Sergeant Morrison prior to Monday's incident. Professional, but limited. We worked in different sections and had minimal direct interaction. I had no personal conflicts with Sergeant Morrison, and I don't believe he was aware of my concerns about his training methods. Have you had any disciplinary issues during your 8 years of service? No, ma'am. My service record reflects consistent performance above standards. Mitchell spent several minutes reviewing documents from Maria's file, her expression revealing nothing about what she was finding. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of military life continuing outside. Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm going to read you portions of witness statements collected yesterday and ask for your response. Mitchell opened a thick folder that Maria hadn't noticed before. Private First Class Williams states, and I quote, "Staff. Sergeant Santos attacked Drill Sergeant Morrison without warning while he was conducting normal corrective training. She seemed angry about something and just grabbed his arm and twisted it until it broke." Maria felt her stomach drop. She had expected some witnesses to interpret events differently, but the characterization of her actions as an unprovoked attack was devastating. "Private Williams' statement is inaccurate," Maria replied as calmly as she could manage. "I intervened when I observed Sergeant Morrison raising his hand in what appeared to be a threatening gesture toward Private Hayes. My action was a defensive response to protect a soldier who appeared to be in immediate danger." Mitchell made notes and continued. Specialist Rodriguez states, "Drill Sergeant Morrison was doing his job, trying to toughen up a soldier who was crying during training. Staff Sergeant Santos seemed to think she knew better and decided to take matters into her own hands. Each statement felt like a physical blow." Maria realized that the political dynamics she had tried so carefully to navigate were now working against her. Soldiers who had remained silent while Morrison terrorized their peers were now protecting him in their official statements, either from misguided loyalty or fear of retaliation. "I understand that witnesses may have different perspectives on the events," Maria said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I can only describe what I observed and the factors that influenced my decision to intervene." But Mitchell wasn't finished. Sergeant First Class Parker states, "Santos has always seemed to think she was better than the rest of us. She acts like she's some kind of hero because she deployed to Afghanistan. Maybe she thought this was her chance to play soldier again." The personal attack stung more than Maria had expected. Parker was someone she had considered a colleague, if not a friend. They had worked together on several training exercises, shared meals in the dining facility, maintained what she thought was a relationship based on mutual respect. Now he was characterizing her service, her motivations, her very identity in terms designed to destroy her credibility. Sergeant Parker's characterization of my motivations is incorrect, Maria replied, but she could hear the defensive edge creeping into her voice. My actions were based solely on my assessment of the immediate situation, not on any desire for attention or validation. Mitchell set aside the witness statements and leaned back in her chair, studying Maria with the calculating expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Staff Sergeant Santos, I've been conducting investigations like this for 12 years. I've seen good soldiers make bad decisions, bad soldiers make good excuses, and political situations that complicate Clear-cut cases. What I'm seeing here doesn't fit any of those patterns. Maria wasn't sure if this observation was encouraging or ominous. I'm seeing a decorated combat veteran with an exemplary service record who risked her career to protect a subordinate she barely knew, Mitchell continued. I'm also seeing witness statements that range from supportive to hostile, with political undercurrents that suggest this incident has exposed tensions that existed long before Monday morning. The colonel opened another folder, this one thicker than the others. Which brings me to the second phase of this investigation. While interviewing witnesses about Monday's incident, several soldiers mentioned concerns about Drill Sergeant Morrison's training methods that corroborate your allegations. Maria felt her heart skip a beat. She had hoped that the investigation would uncover other witnesses to Morrison's behavior, but she hadn't dared to expect it. Corporal Chun provided a detailed statement about Morrison's treatment of soldiers. In his unit, Mitchell continued, his account includes specific incidents, dates, and witnesses that paint a picture consistent with your testimony. The relief was overwhelming. Mike Chen had found the courage to speak officially about what they had all witnessed, despite the political risks involved. Private Hayes herself provided a statement describing months of harassment that escalated to the point where she feared for her physical safety, Mitchell added. Her account of Monday morning's incident supports your version of events, including Morrison's threatening gesture and your intervention. Maria closed her eyes briefly, feeling vindicated for the first time since this ordeal began. Hayes had overcome her fear and told the truth, despite pressure she must have faced to minimize the incident or blame Maria for making it worse. Additionally, Mitchell said, her voice taking on a harder edge, I've discovered that this isn't the first time concerns have been raised about Drill Sergeant Morrison's methods. 3 soldiers have requested transfers from his unit in the past 6 months, and all 3 cited incompatible training styles as their reason. When I interviewed them yesterday, they provided detailed accounts of harassment that go far beyond legitimate corrective training. The pieces were falling into place. The pattern Maria had observed was being documented, corroborated, transformed from her personal concerns into official evidence of systematic misconduct. Finally, Mitchell said, I've received information suggesting that some of the witness statements supporting Sergeant Morrison may have been influenced by factors unrelated to the actual events of Monday morning. Maria looked up sharply. What kind of factors? Private Williams, who characterized your actions as an unprovoked attack, is currently facing disciplinary action for stealing from the post exchange. Sergeant Morrison discovered the theft and agreed not to report it in exchange for Williams' loyalty. Specialist Rodriguez owes Morrison $500 from a poker game and has been working extra duties to pay off the debt. The corruption ran deeper than Maria had imagined. Morrison hadn't just been abusing his authority to harass soldiers. He had been building a network of compromised subordinates who would protect him when his behavior was challenged. I'm telling you this, Mitchell continued, because I want you to understand that this investigation has evolved beyond the specific incident of Monday morning. What started as a case about your actions has become an examination of systematic leadership failures that appear to have been ongoing for months. Maria felt the weight of months of moral compromise and political calculation lifting from her shoulders. The truth was emerging, piece by piece, witness by witness, document by document. The system she had served faithfully for 8 years was finally working the way it was supposed to work. But Mitchell's next words reminded her that vindication and justice weren't the same thing. However, Staff Sergeant Santos, the fact that Drill Sergeant Morrison's behavior was problematic doesn't automatically justify your response. You still broke a superior officer's arm without following proper procedures for reporting misconduct. The question this investigation must answer is whether your actions were reasonable given the totality of circumstances, or whether you should have found another way to address your concerns. The room fell silent except for the steady hum of the recording equipment. Maria understood that she was at a crossroads, not just in this investigation, but in her entire understanding of how justice worked in institutions designed to maintain order above all else. "Colonel Mitchell," Maria said slowly, "if you had been standing in my position on Monday morning, watching Drill Sergeant Morrison raise his hand to strike Private Hayes, what would you have done?" Mitchell studied her for a long moment before responding. "Staff Sergeant Santos, that's exactly the question this investigation is designed to answer." 3 hours later, as Maria walked out of Conference Room B, she knew that the truth was finally emerging from months of silence and complicity. The investigation that had begun as an examination of her actions had become something much larger, a reckoning with the toxic culture that had allowed Morrison's behavior to flourish unchecked. But she also knew that truth and justice weren't always the same thing, and that her fate would ultimately be decided by people who valued order and hierarchy above individual courage and moral clarity. The next few days would determine whether the system she had served faithfully would reward her for doing the right thing, or punish her for disrupting the careful balance of power that kept institutions functioning smoothly. As she walked across the base in the late afternoon sun, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope that her sacrifice might actually lead to meaningful change. Not just for herself, but for every soldier who had suffered in silence while good people looked the other way. By Thursday morning, Fort Henderson felt like a different base entirely. The investigation had taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond the original incident to examine patterns of behavior that had been hidden in plain sight for months. Maria could sense the change in the way soldiers moved through their daily routines, conversations that stopped when officers approached, glances exchanged between subordinates who had previously seemed isolated in their suffering. A subtle but unmistakable shift in the power dynamics that governed military life. Colonel Mitchell had spent Wednesday interviewing more than 30 soldiers, building a comprehensive picture of Morrison's leadership that extended far beyond Monday morning's confrontation. Each interview had revealed new details, new incidents, new examples of behavior that violated both military regulations and basic human decency. But more importantly, the investigation had created space for soldiers to speak truths they had been carrying in silence for months. Maria was reviewing training schedules in the S1 office when Captain Williams approached her desk with an expression that mixed professional neutrality with something that looked almost like excitement. "Staff Sergeant Santos, Colonel Mitchell wants to see you in Conference Room B at 1400 hours. This isn't another formal interview. She wants to brief you on the investigation's preliminary findings." The walk across the base to the headquarters building felt different than it had on Tuesday. Soldiers who had previously avoided eye contact now offered subtle nods of acknowledgement. Some looked at her with expressions that seemed to say, "Thank you," without voicing words that might be overheard by the wrong people. Others maintained careful neutrality, still calculating which side of this controversy offered the safest political position. Conference Room B had been transformed into an investigation command center. The sterile government furniture was now covered with charts, timelines, witness statements, and documentation that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic misconduct. Colonel Mitchell looked up from a laptop computer as Maria entered, her expression revealing satisfaction mixed with the grim determination of someone who had uncovered corruption that ran deeper than anticipated. "Staff Sergeant Santos, please. Have a seat. I want to share what we've discovered over the past 3 days." Mitchell gestured to a chair positioned to face the wall where she had arranged a timeline of incidents spanning the previous 8 months. "What started as an investigation into your actions on Monday morning has evolved into an examination of leadership failures that affect the entire training company," Mitchell began. "We've identified 17 separate incidents of misconduct by Drill Sergeant Morrison, ranging from verbal harassment based on racial and gender stereotypes to financial exploitation of subordinate soldiers." Maria studied the timeline, seeing her own observations transformed into official documentation. Each incident was marked with dates, witnesses, and supporting evidence that transformed individual complaints into a pattern of systematic abuse. More significantly, Mitchell continued, we've uncovered evidence that Morrison's behavior was known to several members of the chain of command, including First Sergeant Thompson and Captain Rodriguez, but no formal action was taken to address the misconduct. The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. First Sergeant Thompson, whom she had respected and trusted, had known about Morrison's behavior and chosen to ignore it. The institutional failure ran deeper than she had imagined, extending beyond one toxic leader to encompass a system that protected predators rather than their victims. Private Hayes provided particularly compelling testimony, Mitchell said, opening a folder that contained what appeared to be a detailed statement. Her account describes months of escalating harassment that culminated in explicit threats of physical violence. She stated, and I quote, "Drill Sergeant Morrison told me that if I didn't stop crying during training, he would give me something to really cry about. When Staff Sergeant Santos stepped in, I believed she saved me from being assaulted." Maria felt tears threatening for the first time since this ordeal began. Hayes' words validated her split-second decision in a way that no amount of legal analysis could match. Additionally, Mitchell continued, we've discovered that Morrison's financial exploitation of soldiers was more extensive than initially suspected. He was operating what amounted to a loan shark operation, using his position of authority to coerce soldiers into gambling debts and then demanding payment through additional duties, sexual favors, and personal services. The scope of corruption was staggering. Morrison hadn't just been a bully. He had been running a criminal enterprise using military authority as his enforcement mechanism. Corporal Chun provided documentation of payments he made to Morrison over a 6-month period, totaling more than $2,000, Mitchell said. Private Williams confirmed that his theft from the post exchange was committed under duress, with Morrison threatening to fabricate disciplinary charges if Williams didn't provide him with stolen merchandise. Maria realized that the witness statements that had initially seemed to support Morrison were actually evidence of his criminal behavior. He had been using compromised soldiers as character witnesses, knowing they would lie to protect themselves from exposure. But the most significant development, Mitchell said, her voice taking on a harder edge, concerns Morrison's family connections and how they influenced the handling of previous complaints. Maria looked up sharply. She had known about Morrison's relationship to Colonel Patricia Morrison, but had assumed it provided passive protection rather than active interference with military justice. We discovered that 3 formal complaints about Morrison's behavior were filed with the Equal Opportunity Office over the past year, Mitchell continued. All 3 complaints were dismissed without investigation after Colonel Morrison intervened directly with the EO officer, claiming that the allegations were motivated by personality conflicts rather than legitimate misconduct. The institutional corruption was breathtaking in its scope. Morrison had been systematically abusing soldiers under his command, while his aunt used her authority to prevent accountability. The military's own oversight mechanisms had been compromised by nepotism and political considerations. Colonel Morrison is currently being investigated by a separate IG team from division headquarters, Mitchell said. Her interference with misconduct investigations violates multiple regulations and potentially constitutes criminal obstruction of justice. Maria felt the foundations of her understanding shifting beneath her feet. What had started as her personal decision to protect Private Hayes had exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of base command. The system she had served faithfully for 8 years was revealed to be more broken than she had ever imagined. Which brings me to your situation, Mitchell said, closing the folders and focusing her attention directly on Maria. The evidence clearly establishes that Drill Sergeant Morrison was engaged in systematic misconduct that created a hostile environment for soldiers under his command. It also establishes that normal channels for addressing misconduct had been compromised by command interference. Maria held her breath, waiting for the assessment that would determine her future. Your actions on Monday morning were technically violations of military discipline, Mitchell continued. You used physical force against a superior officer without following proper procedures for reporting misconduct. However, the totality of circumstances suggests that your actions were reasonable given the immediate threat you perceived, and the failure of institutional safeguards that should have prevented the situation from escalating to that point. The careful legal language couldn't disguise the significance of Mitchell's assessment. Maria was being told that her actions, while technically violations, were justified by the circumstances that created them. My preliminary recommendation to the commanding general will be that you receive administrative counseling for failure to follow proper procedures, but that no criminal charges or punitive action be taken, Mitchell said. Additionally, I'm recommending that you receive a commendation for moral courage and protection of subordinate soldiers. Maria felt overwhelmed by relief, vindication, and something that felt almost like grief for the institutional trust she had lost over the past week. The system had ultimately worked, but only after forcing her to risk everything she had worked to achieve. There's more, Mitchell said. The investigation has revealed systemic problems that extend beyond individual misconduct. I'm recommending a comprehensive review of leadership training, oversight procedures, and reporting mechanisms throughout the installation. Your actions have catalyzed changes that will benefit every soldier stationed here. As Maria walked out of Conference Room B an hour later, she felt transformed by the knowledge that her moment of moral courage had accomplished something far greater than protecting one 19-year-old private. The investigation had exposed corruption, ended careers built on abuse of power, and forced institutional changes that would protect future generations of soldiers. But the personal cost was becoming clear as well. First Sergeant Thompson, whose career would likely end in disgrace due to his failure to address known misconduct, avoided eye contact when she passed him in the corridor. Other NCOs who had remained silent while Morrison terrorized soldiers now looked at her with mixtures of resentment and fear, understanding that the old rules of complicity and willful blindness no longer applied. The base felt different because it was different. Maria's 5-second decision to break Morrison's arm had shattered more than bone. It had broken open a culture of silence that had protected predators at the expense of their victims. The ripple effects would continue for months as investigations expanded, careers ended, and new leaders took positions with the understanding that accountability was no longer optional. That evening, as Maria sat in her apartment reviewing the day's revelations, she received a phone call that put everything in perspective. Sergeant Santos? The voice was young, nervous, barely recognizable as belonging to Private Hayes. Private Hayes, how are you doing? I wanted to thank you, Hayes said, her voice growing stronger. Not just for Monday morning, but for everything that's happened since. I know it's cost you a lot, standing up for me, and I want you to know that it mattered. Maria felt tears flowing freely for the first time since this ordeal began. You don't need to thank me, Jennifer. You found the courage to tell your story when it counted. That's what made the difference. I'm staying in the Army, Hayes said. I thought about leaving, thought about giving up, but I realized that if I quit now, then Morrison wins, and I'm not going to let him win. After the call ended, Maria sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about the young woman who had found the strength to continue serving despite everything she had endured. Hayes represented something that couldn't be quantified in investigation, reports, or legal proceedings: the human cost of toxic leadership and the resilience of people who refused to be broken by those who abused their authority. The investigation was nearly complete. The institutional changes were being implemented, and justice was being served. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. A 19-year-old soldier had kept her faith in principles larger than personal comfort. Just as Maria had done 8 years earlier when she first enlisted, the system had been changed, but, more importantly, the people within it had been reminded of what they were supposed to be serving. The silence had been broken, and it would not be easily restored. 6 months later, the morning sun cast familiar shadows across the training field at Fort Henderson, but everything else had changed. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stood at the edge of a formation of 180 new recruits, watching Drill Sergeant Patricia conduct morning physical training with the kind of firm but respectful leadership that had become the new standard since the Morrison investigation concluded. Maria's role had evolved dramatically in the months following Colonel Mitchell's report. Rather than facing court-martial or career destruction, she had been promoted to the newly created position of Senior Leadership Development Instructor, tasked with training NCOs throughout the installation on proper mentorship techniques and ethical leadership principles. The irony wasn't lost on her that breaking Morrison's arm had ultimately led to the most fulfilling assignment of her military career. The changes at Fort Henderson had been comprehensive and swift. Colonel Patricia Morrison had been relieved of her duties and faced court-martial for obstruction of justice, her career ending in disgrace after 30 years of service. Morrison himself had been sentenced to 18 months in military prison, after pleading guilty to charges ranging from financial exploitation to assault. More importantly, the institutional reforms had created systems that would prevent similar abuses from taking root in the future. Private Hayes, now Specialist Hayes, had become one of the most respected soldiers in her unit. The young woman who had once trembled under Morrison's abuse had found her voice and her strength, developing into the kind of leader who protected others the way Maria had protected her. She had received early promotion to specialist and was being considered for acceleration to sergeant, a recognition of both her technical competence and her moral courage. But the most significant changes were harder to quantify. The culture of silence that had allowed toxic leaders to flourish had been replaced by an environment where soldiers felt empowered to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. New reporting procedures had been established, oversight had been strengthened, and leadership training now emphasized ethical decision-making alongside tactical competence. Maria's reputation had spread far beyond Fort Henderson. She received speaking invitations from military installations across the country, asking her to share her experience and the lessons learned from the Morrison case. The story of the staff sergeant who had broken a drill sergeant's arm to protect a private had become a touchstone for discussions about moral courage and military leadership. 2 years later, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos stood in the auditorium at the Army Leadership Development Center at Fort Benning, addressing 300 newly promoted NCOs from installations across the southeastern United States. The formal promotion and assignment to the Premier Leadership School represented the Army's institutional recognition that her actions had been not just justified, but exemplary. Leadership isn't about power over people, Maria told the assembled sergeants. It's about power used on behalf of people. Every decision you make as an NCO should be guided by a simple question. Does this action serve my soldiers' best interests, or does it serve my own? In the front row, she could see Sergeant Jennifer Hayes, now serving as an instructor at the same facility. Hayes had become everything Maria had hoped she would, a confident, capable leader who used her experience with abuse to recognize and prevent similar situations from developing under her watch. The young woman who had once cried under Morrison's harassment now trained other leaders on creating positive training environments that built soldiers up rather than tearing them down. The Morrison case had become a case study taught throughout the Army's professional military education system, not just as an example of misconduct and its consequences, but as a demonstration of how individual moral courage could catalyze institutional change. Maria often found herself uncomfortable with the hero narrative that had grown up around her actions. preferring to focus on the systemic reforms that had emerged from the controversy. The financial crimes investigation had revealed corruption that extended far beyond Morrison's unit. More than 20 soldiers had been exploited through his loan shark operation, and several other NCOs had been found to be operating similar schemes throughout the installation. The comprehensive reform of financial counseling services and regulation of soldier-to-soldier lending had eliminated these predatory practices entirely. But Maria's greatest satisfaction came from the letters she received from soldiers who had found the courage to report misconduct because they had heard her story. Young NCOs who stood up to toxic leaders, junior enlisted soldiers who refused to tolerate harassment, officers who prioritized people over politics, all of them citing the example of the staff sergeant who had risked everything to protect. One private. 5 years later, Master Sergeant Maria Santos walked through the corridors of the Pentagon, carrying briefing materials for a meeting with senior Army leadership about the expansion of ethical leadership training throughout the service. Her assignment to the office of the Chief of Staff represented the pinnacle of enlisted career progression, but more importantly, it provided a platform to influence policy at the highest levels of military decision-making. The Pentagon assignment had come with opportunities she had never imagined. She had briefed members of Congress on military culture and leadership development, consulted with other services on their own ethics training programs, and worked with civilian organizations to translate military leadership principles to corporate environments. The story that had begun with 5 seconds of moral courage on a training field in Georgia had evolved into a career dedicated to institutional transformation. Private Hayes, now Captain Jennifer Hayes, after completing officer candidate school and earning her commission, served as Maria's deputy in the ethics training program. The former victim of abuse had become one of the Army's most effective advocates for cultural change, using her personal experience to validate the importance of moral courage in leadership development. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The two women had developed a partnership that transcended traditional military hierarchies. Maria brought institutional knowledge and political savvy to their work, while Hayes provided the authentic voice of someone who had experienced both the worst and best of military leadership. Together, they had created training programs that were being adopted throughout the Department of Defense, but the most meaningful validation of their work came in the form of letters from soldiers whose lives had been changed by leaders who had learned to prioritize people over politics. Stories of toxic NCOs being removed before they could cause lasting damage, of junior soldiers finding the courage to report misconduct, of commanders who chose moral courage over career advancement when faced with ethical dilemmas. The ripple effects had extended far beyond individual cases. Suicide rates among junior enlisted soldiers had decreased significantly at installations where the new leadership training had been implemented. Retention rates had improved as soldiers developed greater trust in their chain of command. Most importantly, the culture of silence that had once protected predators had been replaced by an environment where accountability was expected rather than feared. 10 years later, Command Sergeant Major Maria Santos stood on the same training field at Fort Henderson where her career-defining moment had occurred a decade earlier. She was visiting the installation as part of a tour of Army training facilities, but her presence carried special significance for the soldiers and leaders who understood the history of this place. The changes at Fort Henderson had become a model for installations throughout the Army. The comprehensive reforms that had begun with the Morrison investigation had evolved into a culture of excellence that attracted the best leaders and produced the finest soldiers. The base that had once been known for toxic leadership was now recognized as the premier example of ethical military culture. Specialist Hayes, now Colonel Jennifer Hayes, commanding officer of the installation, walked beside Maria as they toured the facilities that had been transformed over the past decade. The young woman who had once trembled under Morrison's abuse now led 15,000 soldiers with the kind of principled leadership that inspired rather than intimidated. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't acted that morning?" Hayes asked as they paused at the spot where Morrison's career had ended, and both their destinies had been transformed. Maria considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes," she replied, "but not with regret. I think about all the soldiers who might have suffered if that moment had passed differently. I think about the changes that might never have happened if someone hadn't been willing to pay the price for doing what was right." The afternoon sun painted the training field in golden light, and Maria could see new soldiers conducting physical training under the watchful eyes of leaders who understood that their authority came with responsibilities that extended far beyond mission accomplishment. These young NCOs had been trained in the principles that had emerged from a 5-second decision made in defense of moral courage. The story had become larger than either woman had imagined possible. It was taught in leadership schools, studied in military academies, and referenced in discussions about organizational culture throughout the government. But for Maria, the most important legacy was simpler: the knowledge that principled leadership had replaced toxic authority, that protection had triumphed over predation, that silence had been permanently broken by the sound of justice being served. As they walked back toward the headquarters building, Hayes asked the question that had defined their partnership for the past decade: "What's next?" Maria smiled, thinking about the programs they were developing, the leaders they were training, the culture they were continuing to transform. "We keep building on what we started," she replied. "We keep proving that moral courage isn't just about individual moments. It's about creating systems that make those moments unnecessary." The sun was setting over Fort Henderson, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that reminded Maria of the sunsets she had watched from guard towers in Afghanistan, where she had first learned the difference between following orders and making decisions that would define who she was. But this sunset was different. It marked not the end of something, but the continuation of changes that would outlive everyone who had witnessed their beginning. 15 years later, General Maria Santos stood before the Army War College's graduating class, delivering the commencement address to 200 future strategic leaders who would guide the Army through the next decades of challenges and opportunities. Her 4-star rank represented not just personal achievement, but institutional recognition that moral courage was not an obstacle to military success. It was the foundation upon which lasting success was built. The student body included officers from every branch of the military, senior civilians from defense agencies, and international partners from allied nations. But Maria's message remained the same one she had been delivering for 15 years. That leadership without moral foundation was not leadership at all, but merely the exercise of temporary authority. 15 years ago, I was a staff sergeant, facing a choice between personal safety and protecting a soldier under my command, Maria told the assembled future leaders. That choice seemed impossible at the time. It appeared to require sacrificing everything I had worked to achieve. But what I learned in the years that followed is that moral courage isn't about sacrifice. It's about understanding what truly matters and having the strength to act on that understanding. In the audience, she could see General Jennifer Hayes, now serving as the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, responsible for the career development and welfare of over 1 million soldiers. The relationship that had begun with protection and vulnerability had evolved into a partnership that had transformed an entire institution's understanding of leadership and accountability. The Army of 2040 bore little resemblance to the institution Maria had joined 23 years earlier. The cultural changes that had begun with the Morrison investigation had rippled outward, influencing everything from recruitment practices to retirement planning. Zero tolerance for abuse had been replaced by proactive identification and prevention of toxic leadership. The reporting systems that had once protected predators now empowered victims and witnesses to seek justice without fear of retaliation. But the most significant change was harder to quantify: the transformation of military culture from one that demanded silent endurance of abuse to one that expected moral courage from every leader at every level. The story of the staff sergeant who had broken a drill sergeant's arm had become more than history. It had become a foundational narrative that defined institutional values. Maria's personal journey had taken her through assignments she could never have imagined as a young enlisted soldier from San Antonio. She had served in combat, led training organizations, developed policy at the highest levels of government, and commanded units ranging from companies to divisions. But every assignment had been guided by the lessons learned in that 5 The sergeant tried to hit her until she broke his arm in front of 205 soldiers. The student body included officers from every branch of the military, senior civilians from defense agencies, and international partners from allied nations. But Maria's message transcended military culture. It spoke to the universal human challenge of choosing principle over convenience, courage over comfort. 15 years ago, Maria began, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. I was a staff sergeant facing the most important decision of my career. In 5 seconds, I had to choose between following the unwritten rules that governed military politics and following the moral principles that had guided my entire life. The audience was silent, understanding that they were hearing from someone whose personal experience had reshaped institutional culture throughout the Department of Defense. I chose to break my superior's arm rather than allow him to break a young soldier's spirit. That decision cost me sleep, relationships, and years of uncertainty about my future. But it also taught me the most important lesson of my military career. Institutions don't change because leaders issue new policies or regulations. They change when individuals have the courage to act on their principles, regardless of personal cost. In the front row, General Jennifer Hayes listened with the focused attention of someone who had lived through the transformation Maria was describing. Hayes now served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, responsible for talent management and leadership development across the entire Army. Her journey from terrified private to senior general represented the institutional changes that had emerged from one moment of moral courage. The young private I protected that morning is now General Hayes, Maria continued, gesturing toward her longtime partner in institutional reform. But her promotion isn't what matters most about this story. What matters is that we created a system where soldiers like her can thrive based on merit and character, rather than their ability to survive toxic leadership. The reforms had spread far beyond the military. Corporate leadership programs now included case studies from the Morrison investigation, teaching business leaders about the importance of ethical decision-making and the costs of toxic workplace cultures. Universities offered courses on moral courage that used Maria's experience as a framework for understanding how individuals could catalyze organizational change. But the most significant impact had been on the next generation of military leaders. The officers and NCOs who had grown up in the post-Morrison Army understood that moral courage wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. They had been trained to recognize abuse, empowered to report misconduct, and supported when they made difficult ethical decisions. Leadership, Maria told the graduating class, isn't about having power over people. It's about having the wisdom to use that power responsibly, the courage to protect those who can't protect themselves, and the strength to do what's right even when it costs you everything you've worked to achieve. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but Maria knew that the real test would come when these future leaders faced their own moments of moral crisis. Would they remember this message when their careers were on the line? Would they choose principle over politics when the stakes were highest? Retired General Maria Santos stood in her small office at the Santos Institute for Ethical Leadership, the non-profit organization she had founded to extend the principles of moral courage beyond military culture. At 62, she had traded her uniform for civilian clothes, but her mission remained unchanged, creating leaders who would prioritize people over politics, principle over convenience. The Institute's work had expanded globally with programs operating on every continent and partnerships with organizations ranging from Fortune 500 companies to international humanitarian agencies. The core message remained simple: individual moral courage could transform institutional culture, only if people were willing to pay the price for doing what was right. Maria's desk was covered with letters from leaders who had found the strength to make difficult, ethical decisions because they had learned about her experience. A CEO who had blown the whistle on financial fraud at his company. A nurse who had reported patient abuse despite threats to her career. A teacher who had stood up to administration policies that harmed vulnerable students. All of them citing the example of the staff sergeant who had risked everything to protect one private. But the letter that meant the most had arrived that morning from Private First Class David Chun, the grandson of Corporal Mike Chun, who had supported Maria during the original investigation. The young soldier was writing from his deployment in Eastern Europe, where he was serving as an infantry medic with the kind of principled leadership that had become the standard throughout the modern military. Ms. Santos, he had written, I wanted you to know that my grandfather told me your story when I enlisted last year. He said that moral courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Yesterday, I had to report my platoon sergeant for inappropriate behavior toward female soldiers. It was scary, and I knew it. Might cause problems for me, but I remembered what you did and found the strength to speak up. The investigation is ongoing, but 3 soldiers have thanked me for giving them a voice. I wanted you to know that your example is still making a difference. Maria wiped away tears as she finished reading the letter. 20 years after breaking Morrison's arm, her decision was still rippling through the lives of people she would never meet, creating waves of positive change that extended far beyond her ability to track or measure. The phone rang, interrupting her reflection. It was General Hayes, calling from the Pentagon with news that would close the circle on their decades-long partnership. Maria, I wanted you to be the first to know. The Army has approved our proposal for the Santos Hayes Center for Leadership Excellence. It will be the premier institution for training ethical leaders throughout the Department of Defense. The center would be located at Fort Henderson, built on the same ground where Morrison had terrorized soldiers and where Maria had made the decision that changed everything. It seemed fitting that the place where toxic leadership had flourished would become the epicenter of efforts to prevent such abuse from ever taking root again. There's more, Hayes continued. They want you to design the curriculum and serve as the founding director. It would mean coming back to active duty as a civilian consultant. Maria looked around her small office, thinking about the global work the Institute was doing, the lives being changed, the cultures being transformed. The Santos Institute had become larger than its founder, with programs that would continue long after she was gone. But the opportunity to create a permanent institutional legacy, to build something that would train ethical leaders for generations, was irresistible. I'll do it, she said without hesitation. But only if we can guarantee that the center will always prioritize moral courage over institutional convenience, even when it makes people uncomfortable. Hayes laughed, the sound carrying echoes of the frightened 19-year-old who had found her voice because someone had been willing to protect her. Maria, after everything we've been through, do you really think I would accept anything less? The Santos Hayes Center for Leadership Excellence occupied 40 acres of what had once been Morrison's training area, its modern facilities designed to inspire rather than intimidate. General Maria Santos, recalled to active duty at the age of 67, walked through the simulation center where future leaders practiced. ethical decision-making in realistic scenarios that tested their moral courage under pressure. The center trained more than 10,000 leaders annually, from junior NCOs to senior generals, using immersive experiences that challenged them to choose principle over politics when their careers were on the line. The curriculum had been adopted by military forces in 37 countries, creating a global community of leaders committed to ethical service. But Maria's greatest pride was reserved for the memorial wall in the center's main lobby, where the names of soldiers who had died by suicide due to toxic leadership were engraved in black granite. Morrison's victims were remembered there, along with thousands of others whose lives had been lost to abuse, harassment, and institutional indifference. The wall served as a permanent reminder of why their work mattered, why moral courage couldn't. The optional, why silence in the face of abuse was complicity. Private Hayes' name wasn't on the wall, but her story was told in every class, every simulation, every graduation ceremony. The young woman who had found the strength to continue serving despite Morrison's abuse had become a symbol of resilience and the power of principled leadership to transform lives. As Maria prepared for her final retirement ceremony, she reflected on the journey that had begun with 5 seconds of moral courage and evolved into a lifetime dedicated to institutional transformation. The numbers were impressive. Toxic leadership incidents had decreased by 73% at installations where Santos Hayes training had been implemented. Military suicide rates had dropped to their lowest levels in decades. Most importantly, surveys showed that 89% of soldiers now trusted their chain of command to address misconduct appropriately, but statistics couldn't capture the most important changes. The culture of silence that had once protected predators had been replaced by an environment where accountability was expected. Soldiers felt empowered to report abuse without fear of retaliation. Leaders understood that their authority came with responsibilities that extended far beyond mission accomplishment. The retirement ceremony was held on the same field where Morrison had terrorized soldiers and where Maria had made the decision that defined her legacy. As she looked out at the assembled crowd, hundreds of leaders whose careers had been shaped by the principles that emerged from that moment, Maria felt the weight of 25 years of institutional change. General Hayes, now Chief of Staff of the Army, delivered the farewell address with the eloquence of someone who understood that personal transformation and institutional reform were inseparable. General Santos didn't just break a drill sergeant's arm 25 years ago, Hayes told the assembled crowd. She broke a culture of silence that had protected predators for generations. She proved that individual moral courage could transform institutions, that principle could triumph over politics, that doing the right thing was always worth the cost. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze statue depicting Maria's intervention, capturing the moment when moral courage had triumphed over institutional indifference. The inscription read simply, "Moral courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear and defense of principle." As Maria walked away from her final military ceremony, she felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened staff sergeant who had risked everything to protect one private had become a 4-star general, whose legacy would influence military culture for generations. But more importantly, she had kept faith with the principles her parents had taught her, the values that had guided her through 2 decades of service, the moral courage that had defined her entire career. The sun was setting over Fort Henderson, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and red. But the sunset felt different from all the others. It marked not an ending, but a continuation of changes that would outlive everyone who had witnessed their beginning. The culture of ethical leadership that had emerged from 5 seconds of moral courage would continue to evolve, to spread, to transform institutions and lives in ways that Maria could never fully know or measure. As she reached her car, Maria paused to look back at the Santos Hayes Center, where the next generation of leaders was learning that moral courage wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. The building stood as a permanent testament to the power of individuals to change institutions, to the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, to the truth that doing the right thing was always worth the cost. The story that had begun with a young woman's tears and a drill sergeant's raised hand had evolved into something larger than either participant could have imagined. It had become a legacy of moral courage that would inspire leaders for generations, a reminder that individual actions could transform entire institutions, a proof that silence in the face of abuse was never the answer. Maria Santos drove away from Fort Henderson for the final time, carrying with her the knowledge that her 5 seconds of moral courage had created ripples that would continue long after she was gone. The young private she had protected was now leading the Army. The toxic culture that had seemed immutable had been transformed. The silence had been permanently broken by the sound of justice being served, and somewhere in training facilities around the world, new leaders were learning that moral courage wasn't just a nice idea. It was the foundation upon which all ethical leadership was built. The breaking point had become a building point, and the legacy would endure.